These are glimpses from a few public enterprises. It is clear that the Indian public sector contains a bewildering variety of enterprises. Further, the importance of the role played by these enterprises in the Indian economy is also beyond question. However, there is one factor which is common to all of them, and that is the perception by people that public enterprises in India have not delivered what was expected from them. In this program, we will examine a system that is being implemented to improve public enterprise performance in India. It is called MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. Once George Bernard Shaw was approached by a very beautiful woman with a marriage proposal. She wanted to have a child endowed with his brains and her beauty. Shaw, however, declined the offer, pointing out the possibility that what if the child had his looks and her brains. This story, in short, captures the essence of the public enterprise problem. Public enterprises are hybrid institutions created to combine the strength of the private sector and the government. As you know, private sector is supposed to do things right. That is, they are supposed to do things effectively, efficiently, and innovatively. Even though they may not do the right things, government, on the other hand, is supposed to do the right things. For example, control prices, promote balanced regional development. By combining the strengths of the two sectors, it was expected that public enterprises will do the right things and will do them right. Unfortunately, this experiment in genetic engineering seems to have failed. There is a widespread perception all over the world that public enterprises have not delivered what was expected of them. As a response to this general perception, there has been a massive outpouring of literature on this subject. This literature can be divided into two broad categories. Most of this literature deals with what is called privatization. The other part of this literature deals with performance improvement. And MOU falls under this category of performance improvement approaches. The concept of MOU is very simple. It is supposed to be a freely negotiated document between government acting as the owner of the public enterprise and the public enterprise. Second, it is supposed to clearly specify the intentions, obligations, and mutual responsibilities of both parties to the MOU. Finally, MOUs make an attempt to move the management of public enterprises from management by controls and procedures to management by results or management by objectives. Another way of saying the same thing is they make an attempt to move the management of public enterprises from ex ante control to ex post controls. In fact, in the literature you find that a wide variety of terms have been used to describe essentially the same approach. In India, we call it the Memorandum of Understanding, but in other countries it has been called performance contract, contrat du plan, contrat de stabilité, performance agreement, and so on. However, this need not confuse us, because finally there are only two broad approaches to MOUs. One, the French system, and the other, the signaling system. The French system started some 25 years back with the recommendation of the famous Nora report. Since then it has been tried in a large number of countries, primarily in Francophone African countries and in some Latin American countries. Based on the experience of designing and implementing systems which were similar to the French model, a new system was introduced in Pakistan in the early 1980s. This system was called the signaling system. Since then, signaling system has been tried in many other countries, primarily in South Korea, Venezuela, and in some African countries. Our system in India is closer to the signaling system. To find out more about the origins of MOUs in India, we asked Mr. Suresh Kumar, who's Secretary, Department of Public Enterprises in Government of India, to tell us more about the origin of MOUs in India.
The expression MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, first appeared on the Indian scene in the year 1985 when Mr. Arjun Sen Gupta, in his report which he presented to the then Prime Minister about the public enterprises in India, brought up the concept of performance contracts in relation to autonomy and accountability of public enterprises in India. This system was being practiced in France for the last 20 years and was variously called contract planning or performance planning and so on and so forth. Mr. Arjun Sen Gupta gave it the term memorandum, gave it the name Memorandum of Understanding. The Government of India accepted the concept that in order to grant greater autonomy and at the same time greater accountability of public enterprise managers, it may be worthwhile to pursue this concept. And the first set of MOUs were discussed in great details by many public sector undertakings, namely SAIL, BHEL and ONGC in the beginning. And the first drafts were signed sometime in the year 1987 for the period 88-89. However, at that stage, it was not very clear as to how to develop performance criteria and how to rate the performance against those criteria. The French system apparently did not go into a great depth in these cases. At that stage, we started looking for alternatives, and we came across the South Korean system, which is also known as the signaling system. A team led by myself visited South Korea in the year 1988, and we examined their system in certain depth. We came back and presented the report to the government, which was accepted, that we will have the contracts or the MOUs in India on the same lines as the South Koreans. The South Korean system was a little different from the French system in the sense that it led to a comprehensive score of performance which was based on a number of criteria which could be linked to various types of performance which a public sector undertaking is expected to perform by the owners, which is the government.
We just heard from Mr. Suresh Kumar that this is not the first time that we have made an attempt to evaluate the performance of public enterprises. To find out more about the previous such attempts, we asked Mr. Ramaswamy R. Iyer, who was Member Secretary of the L.K. Jha Committee on Public Enterprises and has been involved with public enterprise policy for some time.
Well, in a sense, we have not had any institutionalized system in the past for evaluating the performance of public enterprises. while they're set up for a wide range of objectives, by and large, we've gone by the conventional yardstick of financial profitability. Some attempts were made in the past to introduce certain other indicators. Sometime in 1980, I think the Bureau of Public Enterprises brought out a performance criterion model, but it was not a great improvement on the earlier situation. So in a sense, this is a new institution, a new experiment. Broadly, what it tries to do is to achieve clarity of objectives so that we know what we are going to measure performance by. It provides for agreement on objectives between the government and public enterprises, and for the assignment of responsibilities to the two sides, the government and the public enterprises. It provides a basis for the evaluation of the performance. In short, is what the MOU exercise is all about.
As we just heard from Mr. Ramaswamy R. Iyer, MOU is a fairly new concept in India. However, the problem it tries to deal with is not a new one. Different authors in different languages have tried to portray the same problem over and over again. Indeed, there is a growing consensus among the public enterprise experts that the basic problem of public enterprises happens to be that they are faced with multiple principals who have multiple objectives which are often conflicting. For instance, in India, public enterprises have to deal with the administrative ministry, which feels that it has a mandate to control public enterprise. They also have to deal with the finance ministry, the planning commission, the parliament, all of which feel that they have a mandate to supervise the public enterprise. This would not be a problem because in private sector, after all, we have thousands of shareholders. The difference between the private sector and the public sector is that whereas in the private sector, all the shareholders have the same objective, in the public sector, these shareholders have different objectives, which are often conflicting. This leads to a fuzziness of goals and objectives for the public enterprise management. They simply do not know what is expected of them. The purpose of the MOU is to clearly specify what are the objectives of the public enterprises and also what are the responsibilities of the government to enable the enterprises to fulfill these objectives. There is another problem with public enterprises, what we tend to call the not me syndrome. That is, that nobody wants to be held accountable for their performance. For instance, you go to Indian Airlines and tell them, why can't they do a better job? They will turn back and say there's very little they can do. Their performance is affected by the government policies. You go to the government and tell them, why can't they do a better job of managing and making policies? They say that there is very little they can do. They have this constant interference from politicians. You go to the parliamentarians and you ask them, why can't they leave the enterprise and the government to manage the enterprises? They'll appear shocked and surprised and they'll tell you, what do you mean? People have asked us to do this. In other words, people start complaining and they are the ones who get blamed for the problem. And this circle goes on and on forever. And nobody wants to be held accountable. The purpose of the MOU is to break this circle and to clearly identify who is supposed to do what. While all this might sound very conceptual to you, let me share some of the glimpses of the problems of public enterprises as seen by others. Here we see a boss in a public sector reminding his subordinate that he's supposed to work from 9 to 5, not at 9 and then again at 5. Here we have a very wise person, obviously belonging to the private sector, who's telling his colleagues that to err is human, to make a career out of it is government. Subordinate is telling his boss, yes sir, my facts are definitely based on your conclusions. Hopefully that completes our understanding of the problems of public enterprises. So far we have covered the concept of MOU, the origin of MOU, and the purpose of MOU. But before we go on to examine the design and the implementation of MOUs, let us look at the broad objectives of the MOU policy. The objective of the MOU policy is to simultaneously increase autonomy as well as accountability. This sounds simple, but this was not always so. For a long time in the literature, people believed that if you increased autonomy, it would be at the cost of accountability, and vice versa. However, there is an agreement now that they have to go hand in hand. To increase accountability, you must increase autonomy, and to increase autonomy, you must increase accountability, as long as by autonomy you mean autonomy for operations, and by accountability you mean accountability for results. Indeed, that is the crux of the MOU policy. To understand the design and implementation of MOUs, we need to start with a conceptual overview. All experts agree that an effective performance improvement system for public enterprises ought to consist of 3 subsystems. To be precise, we need a performance information system, a performance evaluation system, and a performance incentive system. However, a good performance information system doesn't mean that you have piles and piles of data on all public enterprises. In fact, what you need is timely and appropriate information on public enterprises to be able to design an effective performance improvement system. Once you have this information, the next step is to design a good performance evaluation system. That is, you should be able to evaluate the performance of public enterprises using a system. Finally, you may have all the information you want, you may have the most sophisticated evaluation system, but unless the people who are affected by it care, it's not going to lead to their performance improvement. For that purpose, what you need is an effective performance incentive system. While in this program we will discuss all aspects of a performance improvement system, our focus will be on the performance evaluation system, because that is central to designing an effective MOU system. The discussion on performance evaluation systems can be divided into 2 parts. One dealing with issues relating to criteria, that is, how to evaluate performance. The other relating to institutional arrangements, that is, who should evaluate performance. For performance improvement, both issues are equally important. Let us start by looking at how to evaluate performance. Performance evaluation in MOUs involves 4 steps. First 3 steps are taken at the beginning of the year, and the last step is taken at the end of the year. In the first step, one has to choose an appropriate set of criteria to be included in the MOU. The question is, what constitutes an appropriate criterion? According to the MOU philosophy, only those criteria ought to be included in the MOU which are fair to the manager, fair to the country, and have been negotiated freely. Fairness to managers implies that the criterion should measure only those aspects of managerial performance which are under managers' control. Capacity utilization is a good example. However, there is a danger that the managers, in their enthusiasm to look good, may jack up the capacity utilization beyond the optimum level by postponing the regular maintenance required. Now, this may be fair to the manager, but certainly is not fair to the country, because the manager may move from a small company to a large company as its chairman, but the country is stuck with dilapidated plant and equipment forever. In step 2, we deal with criteria weight selection. Given a long list of things to do, the manager has to be told what are the relative priorities so he can allocate his time more effectively in achieving those priorities. To understand the problem that arises when you don't assign weights to the indicator, let us take an example. Imagine a chief executive of an MOU signing company goes to the secretary at the end of the year and says, "Mr. Secretary, out of the 15 indicators you had given me, I have achieved 13. The secretary could turn back and tell the chief executive that the 2 objectives he did not achieve are the ones he really wanted him to achieve. Now, this problem would have not arisen if both parties had agreed to the relative priorities at the beginning of the year. And that is the importance of having weights at the beginning of the year. The third step in the performance evaluation system relates to criteria value selection. To understand this step, we need to distinguish between criteria and criteria value. Now, miles per gallon is a criteria for measuring efficiency of all kinds of motor vehicles, cars, scooters, trucks, and so on. However, 10 miles per gallon may be excellent for a truck, but is terrible for a scooter. This value of 10 miles per gallon is called the criteria value. It is a value which distinguishes various levels of performance. In the MOU, we have a 5-point scale, where 1 represents excellent performance and 5 represents poor performance. To understand the importance of this 5-point scale, let us once again imagine what would happen if we didn't have a 5-point scale. Suppose at the end of the year, the chairman of an enterprise goes to the secretary and says, "Mr. Secretary, at the beginning of the year, you had set me a target of rupees 385 crores for production. However, at the end of the year, I find that my achievement is only rupees 380 crores. Now, how are we to judge his performance?" Now, if the secretary likes the manager, he's going to say, well, that's close enough, and let's forget about it. But for some reason, if the secretary doesn't like the chairman, he's going to throw up his hands and say that this is the problem with you, Mr. Chairman. You never seem to achieve your targets. Now, if both parties had agreed on a 5-point scale, this problem would not have arisen. Because we know management is not a perfect science. You don't achieve targets with precision. Either there is a shortfall or you exceed the target. Once you have decided the set of criteria to be included in the MOU, the relative priorities and the criteria values, there is nothing we have to do till the end of the year. In fact, there is nothing we should do till the end of the year. This indeed is the very heart of the MOU philosophy, that once you have specified the objectives for the management, you should not interfere in the operations and wait till the end of the year for them to deliver the goods. The fourth and the final step is taken at the end of the year. At the end of the year, we look at the achievements and compare them with the criteria values and determine the scores. For example, if you have the following 5-point scale, where 1 represents excellent performance and 5 poor performance, then we compare the scale with the actual achievements. If the management has achieved a production of 385 crores, then they get a score of 2. If they have achieved a production level of 366 crores, they get a score of 3. If their production is in between these two levels, then they get a score between 2 and 3. This is how we calculate the score for all the indicators included in the MOU. Once we have done that, we take a weighted average of all these indicators and arrive at a composite score. The value of this composite score will also lie between 1 and 5. If the management has done excellent on all fronts in the MOU, they will get a score of 1. But suppose they have done terrible on all fronts, they will get a score of 5. A mixed performance will get them a score somewhere in between 1 and 5. This concept of composite score is a very key concept in the MOU exercise. It measures the ability of the enterprise to meet its own commitment. It also allows us to compare and rank various enterprises according to the composite scores. While the commitments of the enterprises may be different, for example, the commitment of Air India and ONGC are very different, yet through this exercise, we are able to compare the ability to meet their respective commitments. So far, we have seen how the evaluation is done. In the next part of this series, we will see who does the evaluation, an equally important part of this MOU exercise. Hello and welcome to the second part of this series on Memorandum of Understanding. In the first part, we saw what is meant by MOU, its origin, and certain aspects relating to the design and implementation of the MOU policy. We saw that for an effective performance improvement system, you require simultaneous action on several fronts. In particular, you have to have a good performance information system for public enterprises, a performance evaluation system, and a performance incentive system. In the previous part, we focused our attention on the performance evaluation system. We divided the discussion into two parts. That is, how to evaluate performance and who should evaluate performance. In the first part, we concentrated on how to evaluate performance. In this part, we shall focus our attention on who should evaluate performance in the MOU system. In addition, we shall see what has been the effect of the MOU policy on the performance of public enterprises, as well as we will examine what needs to be done to make this policy more effective in the future. Till 1989, one of the major complaints against the MOU policy was its inherent unfairness. The chief executives of the MOU signing public enterprises argued that how can one party to the contract be also the judge of that contract? That is, how can the secretary to the government who signs the MOU also evaluate its implementation? There is a potential conflict of interest involved there, as the secretary has to evaluate his own performance. In response to this concern, the government of India in 1989 set up a high-power committee to evaluate the performance of both parties to the contract. To find more about this high-power committee, we turn now to Mr. P.H. Vaishnav, who is a member of this committee and is also the chairman of the Public Enterprises Selection Board. He has been involved with this committee right from its inception.
Well, the high-powered committee is chaired by the Cabinet Secretary, who is the highest permanent civil servant in the civil services establishment. Then the other members are the Finance Secretary, the Secretary for Expenditure in the Ministry of Finance, the Secretary for the Planning Commission, which is itself a coordinating body deciding allocative priorities, then the Secretary in charge of the Department of Public Enterprises in the Ministry of Program Implementation. He is also the chairman of the Bureau of Public Enterprises, and the chairman of the Bureau of Industrial Costs and Prices. Now, in addition to that, they have also decided to include the chairman of the Public Enterprises Selection Board. As you would have seen from its composition, its members are engaged in areas of coordination of practically the entire gamut of government ministries and sister agencies and the connected public enterprises. And therefore, they already have a certain overview, and this is of great assistance to individual public enterprises in their relation to ministries and the ministries in relation to their public enterprises, because there are many questions that a ministry has to refer to the Ministry of Finance, to the Planning Commission, and sometimes these go to the Cabinet also. Likewise, there are certain issues of policy, of pricing, of wage negotiations, and a host of other things that are not confined to one public enterprise or one ministry, but they cut across ministries. It is again in these areas that a high-powered committee can do a lot by way of providing a considered input into what should be done. And the third thing is that, again, these members, they are advisors to the Cabinet and the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, to whom finally the major issues go for decision making. The association of the high-powered committee with the evaluatory exercise provides them, therefore, means of giving a very informed advice to the Cabinet and to the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs. The high-powered committee suffers from two limitations. One is the time barrier. The members are all very busy people and they cannot give as much time as would be required for a detailed evaluatory exercise. The other one is the expertise barrier, because depending on the enterprise, different expertise has to be brought to bear on this. And in order to overcome these two barriers, we have constituted two committees, one headed by the Secretary of the Department of Public Enterprises in the Ministry of Program Implementation. Now that committee consists of all the seconds in command to the members of the high-powered committee. The other one we have called not a committee but an ad hoc task force. Now that consists of experts who have had previous experience of working in government or in public enterprises, but who belong to neither now. And so therefore, before the high-powered committee gets into session, you have very detailed and expert assessments in a usable form for the high-powered committee's exercise.
As mentioned by Mr. Vaishnav, the High Power Committee is handicapped by lack of time and lack of expertise available to design appropriate MOUs for these enterprises, as well as evaluate their performance based on these MOUs. To overcome this time barrier as well as the expertise barrier, the government has set up two committees, the Permanent Task Force and the Ad Hoc Task Force. We went to the chairman of the Ad Hoc Task Force, Mr. Ramaswamy Araiya, to find out more about its functioning, its role and rationale.
It's a body of some 20 or 25 people, eminent people. Some of them former secretaries to government, former chief executives, economists, chartered accountants, and some management experts, people from the management institutions, academics, and so on. None of them actively associated with government at the present time. This body of 20-odd people provide the necessary objectivity and expertise, and also lend a certain credibility to the exercise. Because of their stature, they enhance the whole system. And they look at the draft MOUs in the first place and approve the draft MOUs with suggestions for amendments, revisions, and so on at the beginning, and come in again at the end and evaluate the performance. And their findings are placed before the High Power Committee.
As mentioned by Mr. Iyer, the Ad Hoc Task Force has some of the best experts available to evaluate the performance of public enterprises. The composition of this Ad Hoc Task Force almost guarantees the high quality of advice which the High Power Committee gets. However, it does not ensure the brevity. Even after the Ad Hoc Task Force has given its advice, a lot of work needs to be done to process this information. This time barrier is overcome by the Standing Committee, or as it is called, the Permanent Task Force. We went to its chairman, Mr. Suresh Kumar, to find out more about its functioning, its role and rationale.
So we have instituted, or we have actually installed a permanent task force in the Bureau of Public Enterprises, where all these nodal ministries are represented at an operational level. And our expectation is that wherever we find in an MOU negotiation process that there are problems relating to clearances from any of these agencies, this permanent task force could take care of it. However, right now I don't think we have faced this problem in any virulent form that there are problems. The problems really arise at the end, not at the beginning. But the institutional arrangement exists. The permanent task force really is a body which functions between the High Power Committee and the Ad Hoc Task Force. The ad hoc task force, as you know, has to look at all the memorandum of understanding, almost participate in the negotiation process, and they can make comments on anything that is happening. If these are the comments which relate to any of the nodal ministries, which are important by themselves for all public sector undertakings, then this permanent task force is the body which becomes the conduit through which the information gets passed on.
We have seen, to make the whole MOU system work, we have three very powerful committees working together. First, we had the High Power Committee, which is ultimately responsible for the efficiency and the effectiveness of the MOU system. It is in turn helped by the Ad Hoc Task Force, which helps it overcome the expertise barrier, and the Permanent Task Force, which helps it overcome the time barrier. Even after all this work is done, there's a lot of coordination work which is required to make the whole system work. This is done by the MOU monitoring cell at the Bureau of Public Enterprises. We went to the director of the MOU monitoring cell, Mrs. Omita Paul, to find out what exactly this cell does.
MOU monitoring cell, we call it MMC here, is primarily acting as the nodal point for all the activities relating to the signing, evaluation and refining of the MOUs. Ours is a small unit. We have technically qualified people, and we work on the basis of network. We call in people when we need them, and our function basically is to act as the storehouse for all the knowledge that we gather in the area of MOU concepts, as well as the training and refinement of the system as it stands today. MOU cell also is involved in the coordination of all the activities of various bodies that have been set up, like the Ad Hoc Task Force, which is a body of experts, the Standing Committee, which is a body of civil servants drawn from the ministries, which are concerned with various clearances that have to be given to the MOU signing companies. MOU cell also deals with and provides the secretarial services to the High Power Committee, which meets about thrice a year to take stock of the MOUs at the stage of drafting, at the stage of finalization, and then at the time of evaluation.
As we have seen, there are a number of committees involved to make the whole MOU system work. Some, however, may argue that there are too many committees involved. In fact, an MOU signing public enterprise doesn't have to face all these committees. It takes the draft MOU, gives it to the MOU monitoring cell, and this MMC takes care of the rest. Before we proceed any further, let us pause and look at the justification for this institutional structure for the MOU system. To start with, this system, this structure, ensures the highest level commitment in the government. Second, it also ensures objective third-party evaluation. In addition, it ensures professionalization rather than bureaucratization of the evaluation process. Also, given the stature of the High Power Committee, it is able to get information required for appropriate performance evaluation of the MOU signing companies, as well as make binding recommendations. The Permanent Task Force ensures that there is a free flow of information between the High Power Committee and the Ad Hoc Task Force, so that the High Power Committee is able to make the right kinds of decisions. And finally, this institutional design ensures that there is fairness and equality during the negotiation process for the MOUs. In Part 1, we said that the major objective of the MOU policy was to simultaneously increase the autonomy as well as the accountability of public enterprises. Having examined the system now in details, let us see how this is sought to be achieved under the MOU system. The autonomy of the public enterprises is sought to be increased under the MOU system by granting greater delegation of power to the MOU signing enterprises, by ensuring that there is no multiple evaluation of the enterprises, by reducing the frequency of evaluation, and finally by reducing the bureaucratic interference in the day-to-day functioning of these enterprises. The accountability of public enterprises under the MOU system is sought to be increased by clear specification of performance criteria, by the comprehensiveness of the performance criteria. That is, now in the MOUs, we don't just have the quantitative aspects of public enterprise performance, we also tend to measure the qualitative aspects of public enterprise performance, such as the quality of service and customer satisfaction. In addition, accountability is also sought to be increased by attaching weights to these indicators so that the managers know what are the priorities. And finally, accountability is strengthened by choosing a 5-point scale so that performance can be evaluated objectively at the end of the year. While we have spoken a lot about the increase in autonomy and accountability of public enterprises under the MOU system, we thought it would be a good idea to talk to some of the chief executives of the MOU signing public enterprises to find out about their perception.
We have been participating in these awards since its inception. And you may be aware that NTPC got the Prime Minister's MOU award for the year 89-90 for exceeding all the targets and for excellence in performance. That's one aspect, that you are recognized. And in fact, there is a distinction today. The MOU company and the non-MOU company. So that's another. But talking in concrete terms, there are certain additional powers which are delegated to the MOU company. For example, the fresh investments are delegated to an MOU company to be up to now, I think, 50 crores. Then there are certain foreign exchange powers which are available to the MOU company. Then there are other administrative powers, I should say, because we are an A-grade company, and previously, the tours of the directors and all that used to be approved in the ministry and all that. So these are all administrative ease which has been given to us. But the main advantage, I should say, is that the monitoring which used to take place in various forums and various institutions is supposed to be now confined only to the MOU areas, and periodically it has to be reviewed. So the paperwork, the monitoring which was going on is now more purposeful, is more pointed. So these are some of the advantages, I think, which are taking place. And secondly, the government has also become aware that the responsibilities it has. Supposing a company requires the certain administrative clearances, certain sanctions, then they have to give those sanctions in time. Otherwise, that company will not be able to perform its target. So the obligations being known to both the parties is a positive step for the improvement of the functioning of the corporations.
Well, the process really starts around 3 months before the start of the financial year, which is 1st of April in our country. So around December of the previous year, the Bureau of Public Enterprises sends intimation to both the administrative ministry and the public sector undertaking that they should prepare the MOU for the next year. Now, when this intimation comes to us in our company, we constitute a multidisciplinary task force, a group consisting of representatives of various functions, the finance, the planning, the personnel, and the various business sectors, to jointly work out the various criteria, their weights, their values, which means the targets for each criteria. The values are in fact derived from the revenue and the capital budget. Now, these criteria, their weight, their values are discussed with the top management, which means the chairman and directors have their total commitment to it, and then these are forwarded in the form of a draft MOU to the administrative ministry, in our case the Department of Heavy Industry presently. Then we have detailed discussions with the ministry on the various criteria, the weights, the values, but the more important thing apart from the criteria and their weights is the criterion values, which means the targets, whether the targets are soft or they are hard. So we have to prove that the criterion value, we want to put a criterion value at number 1, then we have to justify that it is really deserves an excellent type of a rating, which means that the target is really very tough and very challenging. Now this is finished. Once this exercise is finished, there is an agreement, then the MOU is signed at the beginning of the year between the Chief Executive and the Secretary of the Initiative Ministry, and then the process starts. Then during the middle of the year, there has to be a review of the MOU. In BHEL, we have a mechanism in which there is a monthly review meeting of the management committee. The management committee consists of the chairman, the director, the executive directors, and it meets every month as per a predetermined calendar of discussions. It discusses all the MOU targets in static areas as well as the dynamic indicators. What we ought to do in the area of corporate planning, human resource development, research and development, project implementation, so that the MOU is not forgotten. Not that after the MOU has been signed, we forget till the end of the year. Then comes the end of the year. At the end of the year, there is an evaluation against the targets. This is after the end of the year, we know as per the performance report of the company what has been our actual achievement against the various targets. Now, the MOU calculation procedure is quite simple. We have to see what is the actual performance, and depending upon the target, whether it was a 2 or 1, we calculate a score, a raw score, what is called as a raw score for that particular criterion. Now that raw score is multiplied by the criterion value, and we get a composite score. And that composite score for all the criterion together becomes the composite score for the company. The composite score for the company is really a clear indicator of how far the company has been able to meet its own commitments, which it is specified at the beginning of the year after discussions with the ministry in the MOU. So the composite score is a true indicator of the capability of an organization to meet its own commitments as per MOU.
Our biggest challenge in the last 1.5 years has been to convince and persuade people that we are here with very good intentions, that we are here to play a win-win game. MOU is a new system. It's a system which has come into being after a great deal of experimentation all over the world and after due indigenization. It's not a model which has been lifted lock, stock and barrel and tried to be used in this country. But we have done a lot of indigenization.
So in the Indian conditions, we found that a law may become very difficult to operate because we have a variety of highly diversified and different types of public sector undertakings, each one of them having different requirements. And therefore we thought that the negotiation process, which will be custom made for a public sector and its administrative ministry, like the French system, would probably be more appropriate in our case rather than following the legal system of the South Koreans. At the same time, we looked at the Pakistani system, where we discovered that they had chosen only such companies which were in similar areas of operations. They had picked up only manufacturing companies, and therefore they had prescribed a set of criteria for evaluation which was same for all the companies. This we could not do in our case because Air India's requirements would be different from Bharat Heavy Electricals or the Indian Oil Corporation. Therefore, we had to be different from the Pakistani system, which allowed for only one type of company to be put under the system. And it is of course different from the French system, where the distinction between good performance from bad was never made. They had single targets instead of having a range of targets to look at. And they also did not, they concentrated more on financial indicators rather than a comprehensive performance and a set of comprehensive performance indicators.
While no management system can be perfected overnight, there are all indications that the MOUs have made a very promising start here in India.
an MOU is a very good instrument. And the experience of this year would probably make them recognize that for all that they asked and was not given to them last year, it didn't matter. They performed very well, because I have got companies who got scores which was 1 out of 1. And I think 12 companies out of 18 are between 1 and 2. So really speaking, even if the government didn't perform, then what they were asking was incorrect. But if government performed, then this is what they were expecting anyway. So both ways, I think they have succeeded.
Since MOU system is a new system, we are building up a body of knowledge. We had nothing to fall back on because we introduced the system in its present form only about a year ago. So we are trying to fine-tune the policy, because as we go along, we do find that we need to change every now and then. And we are very open to these kind of suggestions that come either from the public sector units or the departments concerned. And we keep on refining the system on an ongoing basis.
What I feel is that as far as the enterprise responsibilities are concerned, they are given in quite quantifiable and concrete terms. But the role which the government takes over as an obligation on itself is given in very general terms. So maybe because the government doesn't want to be very specific or something like that, but I think this is an area where we want to be clear that this is the responsibility of the government. Secondly, we have seen that government agrees sometimes under the MOU to delegate more powers, and it does take time for the actual delegation orders to be issued. It takes sometimes 5 months, 6 months. So some part of the year which is under an MOU goes without the delegated powers being given. So the suggestion is that the day the MOU is signed, that should be the day we should take it that the powers are delegated. So that's another. Thirdly, which we feel is that, of course, this winning of an award is very well. I mean, you feel very elated. But in concrete terms, in financial terms, there should be some recognition. That means there must be a financial award also, which should go along with the fact that somebody has exceeded the target.
We are trying to change a hierarchical system of relationship between the government and the public sector undertaking to one of contract between equals. It is not very easy for civil servants to accept this position. It is equally not easy for the public enterprise managers to accept this position. In fact, it is my view that we should get the civil servants at the younger stage, catch them up in the IAS training school itself, to tell them the changed environment so far as the economy of the country is concerned and the kind of roles they will be expected to play. They would not be expected to play the roles of collectors and behave like collectors when dealing with public sector, but more as partners. But I think the messages are going home. The major problem of training we are tackling. We are trying to increase the training input to the maximum level possible, both in the public sector enterprises as well as in the government. Although I would say that it is still at levels which are, according to me, not satisfactory. But good starts have been made in this area. And so long as the training goes apace, it should be possible for us to think in terms of a good MOU system in operation in the country by the middle of 90s.
However, to have a good system in place by the middle of 90s will require a lot of work. Future generations of managers working with the MOU system will have to share a responsibility of fine-tuning the system to make a good system even better.